G'day Year 12, and again welcome to another YouTube clip. Today we're going to take a look at the first point of influences of human resource management. Just to recap, human resources is about the relationship between the employer, the boss, and the employee, the worker. And as I said before, this is the first syllabus dot point on influences. That dot point is stakeholders. Stakeholders is anybody who has an interest in a business. Some stakeholders that we have in HR include employers, the boss, employees, the workers, employer associations, unions, government organisation, and also greater society. So what you must make sure you can do with this part of the syllabus is to be able to firstly define a stakeholder, and then also to be able to define each of the stakeholders. But it's more than that. You need to also be able to explain how each of these are actually an influence or have an impact upon the human resource management process that's there. Okay, the first thing is stakeholders. Again, these is any person or organisation that is involved in a business or that has an interest in a business. Look, an example is a union. They don't work for the employer, but they're still a stakeholder. They're still there to represent the interests of employee, and hence they have an interest in the business. Now, the first syllabus dot point or example we've got there are employers. Employers can be individuals, companies, the government, or non-profit organisations. They employ the labour, that is the worker, the employee. Now, they're an influence on HR because it's them who directly determines the wages, the conditions, the WH&S, what used to be called OH&S. And you'll see that from time to time in your syllabus, OH&S. If you cross that out, it's just that the syllabus is a bit old, and it's WH&S, Workplace Health and Safety. Also, training and develop monetary and non-monetary rewards. They determine those. They're the ones who, complying with legislation and other inputs, decide what they will be. Now, the second stakeholder of HR are employees. These are workers who are engaged to complete a set of tasks for a reward. And a reward being monetary most of the time, their salary or wage, sometimes non-monetary rewards too. Employers have different aims and objectives to, obviously, the boss to the employer. They seek more individualistic goals, such as better pay and better conditions. So that's a definition that I talked about. Now, ask yourself, how is this an influence? How's it an influence? That's the important part. Employers are seen as an influence because HR wants them to be motivated and productive. Therefore, they need to be paid well, i.e. monetary rewards. But if they're to be paid too well and paid a lot of money, they can be a drain on resources. So you can see that it can add additional costs for human resources. But if they're paid reasonably well, that could increase productivity and actually be a positive for human resources. And we can measure whether these things are good or bad on HR by using the effectiveness criteria that we'll talk about in later YouTube clips and in later lessons. But the next syllabus dot point we have are employer associations. Now, this is something that most of you probably have never really heard before. These are organisations there to support business. Their job is to lobby the government to improve the law for business. Some good examples of these employer associations include the NFF, National Farmers Federation, and also the Business Council of Australia. They're kind of like the bosses union, okay, the employers union, but I don't want you to use that as like a short answer definition, but it gives you an idea of how these things work. They're there to represent not the employees, rather the employer. Got it? How's it an influence? You need to again be asking that question. They are an influence because if they can successfully lobby the government on something, it could result in improved productivity for HR. E.g., something that probably went a little bit too far, certainly went way too far in my view, but I do vote Labor, is work choices that came in some years back. And that really tipped the balance between employees' rights and employers' rights in the favour of the employer. And since then, Labor got in with Kevin Rudd and major things changed back the other way a little bit. Okay, so if the NFF or if we talk about the Business Council of Australia get their way and successfully lobby or pressure the government to change the law, it can really help out the employer. Now, unions are the other side of the equation. They again don't directly work for the employer, but they're there to represent the interests of the employees, the workers. That is, they negotiate on behalf of their members, the employees, to improve their members, the workers, pay and also conditions. Now, some examples of unions include the New South Wales Teachers Federation, which I'm a proud member of, represent, and the ACTU, which is the Australian Council of Trade Union. Now, that's what they are, and that's what they're there to do. But again, how is it an influence? They're an influence on HR because their goal is to improve conditions of employees. If workers get paid better, they'll be more productive. But if they get paid way too well, as in used to be the case with the waterfront workers, the wharfies, then that can impact negatively on the productivity of HR. So like if teachers get paid good money, and they're reasonable money now, they tend to be more productive. Tick. Thank you, unions. But if they get paid excessive amounts, like $200,000 for a standard teaching gig, probably starting to get pretty excessive, then that does increase costs, and that productivity is not measured by the increase in wages. All right, the next stakeholder, and therefore influence from the syllabus, are government organisations. Government organisations include the HRC, Human Rights Commission, Federal Court of Australia, Department of Education, Employment and Workplace Relations, Office of Fair Work Ombudsman, and so on, and also the federal and state governments. Now, as such, it's a key influence. These government organisations are really an influence because it's the government, through Fair Work Australia, which legislation established, sets the award, which is the minimum amount somebody can be paid across all industries. They can be paid more than that, but it's the bottom safety net amount. And they also are able to make decisions upon awards as well that are set there. So it sets the standard for a lot of collective agreements and what people will be paid. Now, the last thing we're going to look at today, the last stakeholder, are society. And this is an indirect influence because society doesn't work for the business, although I guess they are the employees or the employers, but it's seen as an indirect influence. It's involved in the final stage of the process, the purchasing of goods and services from the business. Now, how's this an influence again? It's an influence because more than ever, if a business has a bad reputation and exploits its workers, then society will vote with their feet and they'll not purchase from that business. All right. An example of this in the short term anyhow was Bonds, an Australian clothing manufacturer. They used to manufacture their items in Australia. And as a result of Bonds moving their operations, their human resources, overseas, it was all over the news. Customers voted with their feet and they shopped elsewhere for businesses in Australia that were Aussie made that would make their products in Australia. Now, over time, these things change and a lot of our manufacturing's disappeared anyhow, but it certainly was an influence in that short to medium term, that operational to tactical time frame. Okay, guys, thanks again for listening to these YouTube clips. See you in class. Goodbye.